Welcome to this episode of End of Life Conversations. I'm Reverend Wakil David Matthews.
And I'm the Reverend Mother Annalouiza Mendariz. In this podcast, we share people's experiences with death and dying, grief and loss, and the end of life.
Every episode, we are so honored and blessed to share stories with amazing, compassionate, and wise guests. So let's get started. Thank you all for being here with us today. We have a special episode dedicated on this Valentine's Day to celebrating our beloveds who have crossed over the veil ahead of us.
On Valentine's Day, we generally send tokens of our love to each other. Today, Wakil and I open up a space for people to share their story of the one they loved and cherished. We are so honored to share these personal notes, stories that light up the love that still remains and continues to honor the one who has passed. Enjoy.
So to begin, I'd love to introduce my grandfather. Herbert Hudson Taylor was a missionary's son who spent much of his life in what was then called Formosa, now called Taiwan. He spoke fluent Cantonese, which was always fun when we went out to Chinese dinners. He would surprise the waiters by chatting them up in their own language. I think many times the last thing they expected was for this old white dude to start speaking to them in their language. His namesake was his great-grandfather Hudson Taylor, who was the first Protestant missionary to venture into inland China. Hudson Taylor was a bit of a rogue, as he chose to wear the clothing and style his hair in the long queue down his back that the Chinese peasants in the small village wore. For his trouble, the church rejected him, but he persisted and created schools and medical clinics and achieved a level of fame in Protestant Christian circles for his ministry that went on for many years and still exists today. Of course, it was forced to move to Formosa/Taiwan during the People's Revolution. While I can't say I'm especially proud of their need to convert the Chinese peasants, I understand the culture of the time and their culture, and I do feel a sense of pride, especially for their integrity and their courage to stand up to their church, try to uplift the lives of the oppressed lower classes, and to brave the rigors of living in a small village far from the comforts of the Western world. My grandfather Herbert was also a bit of a rogue. In his youth, he hitchhiked across Canada to work in a logging camp in British Columbia, a pretty wild and dangerous job at the time. He was always willing to talk to me about anything, including theology, even when I became more radicalized in my late teen years. He was a craftsman who taught me wood carving, how to sweat a copper pipe, and to drive a nail. I remember one theological conversation with him when we argued about my assertion that Jesus was a revolutionary. He adamantly disagreed with me, but later he came back to me to say that he had spoken with his minister and he decided that he agreed with me after all. That's one of the things I really loved about him. Even though he grew up deeply ensconced in the conservative evangelical faith, he could and he did listen, and he thought for himself, just like his great-grandfather. He was staying with my mother when he died of brain cancer. Up to the end of his life, he maintained his mischievous sense of humor and his love of life. I was in my early 20s at the time, so I would stop by to see him. He loved to tell his stories. Often they were stories I'd heard before, but I enjoyed them anyway because they gave him a way to connect with his interesting and full life and to remember those he had loved. I really remember at his funeral having perhaps my first experience with losing a close loved one. His wife, my grandmother, had died earlier, but they were out in Illinois at the time, and I didn't attend her funeral. And also, I think it was my first experience with the mystic vision and the mystery of death. As we all sat there in the church with his coffin up in front, people were sobbing and everyone looked so tragic. But as I envisioned him, I felt his presence so deeply and strongly. And in fact, I saw him up above everyone, looking down at us with a big grin on his face and laughing. He was like, "What the heck are you all whining about? This is the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. I am so happy and free." As I saw that vision, a big smile came across my own face. I had to stifle my laughter, I was already considered odd in that community, as I had given up the church and gone full hippie by then. So had I allowed myself to burst out in laughter and express the joy Grandpa Herbert was sending, I'm not sure what folks would have thought. Grandpa Herbert was a rogue right up to the end and beyond. He was my first teacher to remind me not to take things too seriously, and that there is more to our existence than we tend to notice. Thank you, Grandpa Herbert.
And thank you, Wakil, for sharing Grandpa Herbert with me too. Now I will share about my little sister. My little sister Vivian lived with the audacity of a volcano who sends its lava flow out into the world, forcing its own path, its own space, and ultimately its own story. She was born on January 8th, 1972, and in the first few moments of her life, doctors deemed that she would only live a few hours, perhaps a day or two. She came into this world with an extreme version of spina bifida, a neural tube defect. In spite of this, her desire to flow in this life was stronger than surgeons' and pediatricians' prognostications. As a small child, she flowed into the hearts of the hospital staff, church members, and family friends. She was a force to be reckoned with. Vivian braced herself for life by being stubborn and unyielding to what she deemed unfair. I have a picture of her here, smiling on a webbed folding chair. She's about 3 years old, ponytailed, and wearing an orange polka dot dress. In her arm is a newborn kitten I had found, and she is petting it with a curled finger. She stares straight into the camera, a look that takes hold of this moment and says, "You best not forget it." I remember that moment, right before this picture was taken. We had all gone outside, Vivian in one of my parents' arms. She immediately railed against the flies and the wind that unknowingly caused her the utmost distress. She wanted to be inside, but she also wanted us to be inside with her. My parents obliged and placed her on the couch right in front of the door where she could see us. No flies and no wind. Yet she screamed and cried and ultimately flung herself from the couch to the horror of my parents. She was once again brought out, and this time the kitten would be used to focus her energy. Vivian spent a fairly large portion of her life in hospitals. There were surgeries for shunting excess liquid from her brain, and surgeries to close her spine, and surgeries for her mouth, and on and on. Christmas time was the worst time. If Vivian caught a cold, she would immediately be on the way to the hospital, which meant not only did we miss out on holiday functions, she would inevitably spend her birthday in the hospital. We lived with her body casts, an occasional shaved head, warming socks, wheelchairs, crutches, and stranger's pity. When people came up to the both of us, staring down at her small body in a wheelchair, and handed us money, Vivian would side-eye me and we would tear off again. Even then, my sister never identified as handicapped. She didn't understand why she wasn't afforded the same possibility of independence that presumably able-bodied people received. At age 23, she insisted on leaving home and striking out on her own. Driving her car, getting a job at the Marriott, and calling her shots was who she was, and there was no talking her out of it. She struggled with caring for herself in apartments not fully equipped to meet the needs of someone who might be, at best, 4 feet tall in a wheelchair. The bathroom vanity would never be reached. Closet clothes hooks would never be used. The oven was put to use often because she liked to bake Pillsbury Doughboy cinnamon rolls. This task she would accomplish by using a gopher pickup stick used to turn the dial on the stove and set the temperature. She parented feather babies too, Ricky and Lucy, 2 budgies who fought day after day, yet she loved and cherished them like children. The first few years of independent living were hard for her. Not only did our parents worry about her constantly, which set up a dynamic of shutting out people who most liked to be there when things went poorly, and things did go wrong for Vivian. Again, the hospital visits began. She lost a kidney, dealt with life-threatening bed sores, and almost died a few times.
During these years, Vivian and I talked about dying because often I would arrive at the hospital at 3 a.m. and a doctor would usher me into a dimly lit comfort room. He would generally tell me what was going on with Viv and then ask what I would like to do. After a few of these, we had to get her wishes written down. These episodes did not quell the flow of her rage against injustices. She no longer had a car and depended on city transport. When the city decided to make cuts to services for the poor and disabled, she roared. She protested, alone, on busy streets. This wasn't enough, so she ran for city council. She spent $79 out of her own pocket and won 8% of the vote. She didn't win a seat, but she won over other city council members who from then on invited her to meetings and asked about what they could do for Latinos, wheelchair users, disabled people, and so on. She flowed into the hearts of the city officials. By the end of her life, Vivian was known by firefighters who invited her to ride on a fire truck for parades. The chief of police took her out to lunch on a weekly basis and delivered her birds to rehab centers when she was sick and convalescing. When she couldn't physically attend city council meetings, she would watch the public service television station and text different council members as the meeting was being held. She was a burning light of love for the city she called home. When Vivian died in March 2019, her memorial was held at a fire station. When I officiated the memorial, the fire sergeant remarked that in the history of the city, there had just been one other individual allowed to be memorialized in a fire station, and that was a commissioner. My sister's memorial was attended by family, friends, city officials, firemen, and her 2 birds. Even in death, her story will continue to flow and unfold and create a force that has no end.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's so beautiful.
Well, I'm really honored to share her story here on our Valentine's Day. And now we are offering Jane Ellen Nickell's story. We interviewed her on our most recent episode, and she will be sharing the story of when her mother died.
This is Jane Ellen Nickell. I am a retired college chaplain in Meadville, Pennsylvania. And our family, I think, has always had a really healthy attitude about death, so I'm not sure it was ever something I feared. We sort of lived with the possibility of death. My mom had lost her father when she was 3 years old. Her siblings were 5, 8, and 10. When my brothers and I were about the same age, my dad was diagnosed with heart disease, had open heart surgery at the age of 37, had surgery 3 more times, open heart surgery 3 more times, and fortunately, he obeyed the doctors. He had good doctors. He ended up living to 82. But we sort of always lived with that possibility that we would lose him, that he would die of a heart attack. Instead, he died of congestive heart failure, declined over several years. Mom and I were with him when he died. So again, we were very blessed to have him as long as we did and to be able to be with him when he did pass. Mom went on to live independently, traveled with friends, stayed in their house. Right up until the age of 93, she danced at my brother's wedding. December 31st of 2022. So really thrived, lived large, did the things that she loved to do. In the spring of 23, she did have some health issues and sort of began a decline that proceeded over the next few months. And by the end of August was really struggling. She moved into assisted living. 2 days later, she went to the hospital. And 4 days later, she died. So she died fairly quickly. And it was really, her passing was beautiful in those last days in the hospital even. She was very much herself. She did not lose that sense of herself. When I arrived from where I lived to where she was in the hospital, the first thing I asked her was she ready to go? And she said, "You mean die?" And I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "Sure, but I'd rather make it to my birthday." She was 3 weeks shy of turning 94. So we said, whatever we could do, we would try to get her to her birthday. They would not give her anything to eat for several days just because of choking hazard. But when they finally did, she refused because the applesauce was not homemade and she didn't like store-bought. So again, very much herself. She interrupted 2 doctors who were trying to communicate with her. She had this big mask, this BiPAP mask that was helping her expel the carbon dioxide, which was what was keeping her remaining conscious. But anyway, the mask would keep her breathing. Anyway, interrupted 2 doctors to tell us that what kind of dishwasher she wanted us to get for the kitchen. So a message received. Again, very much concerned with things that mattered to her. When it was evident that she wasn't going to be able to go without that mask, we all agreed we did not want her to live like that. So we met with the palliative care team. All of my siblings, my 2 brothers and their wives were on board. The doctor sat on her bed and said, "Now, Ellen, do you understand what's going to happen? We're going to take off this mask and you'll be fine for about an hour, but then you will lose consciousness and eventually you will die." And she said, "Well, it's all in the hands of God." And he said, "Well, we do have a little something to do with that, but yes, you're right. It is in the hands of God." So she agreed. We took the mask off and we had a wonderful about an hour with her. We celebrated her upcoming birthday. She called some friends, the grandchildren that she had not been able to see that week, and was able to talk to them, say some goodbyes. We celebrated her birthday, had some ice cream, and my sister-in-law had made homemade applesauce so that she would have the kind of applesauce that she liked. So we had just a wonderful time. And as I thought about it, it was not, I realized at one point in the middle of all this was the last conversation I was going to have with my mom, but we didn't treat it like that. We didn't, there were no last words or any, what have you not told us? One sister-in-law did thank her for raising such a wonderful son and for welcoming her into our family. But there was no acknowledgement that Mom was dying or that these were her last conscious moments. We just hung out. And even that was very comforting, I think, to us. Once she lost consciousness, we arranged our schedule so that 2 of us were with her around the clock. We didn't want her to die alone. And it was actually just a little over 24 hours later that we were all at her bedside and she slipped away. 3 of us, because of our professions, me as a pastor and a brother and a sister-in-law who are in medicine, had been with people when they died, but my younger brother and my older sister-in-law had not. So their spouses were, very aware of this was something they hadn't been through and sort of keeping an eye on them to make sure they were doing okay, even as we were, spending that time with Mom. And when she passed, we had a pastor come in and bless her, send her off. Her death on her own terms, I think, just as my dad's, was a great gift to us. We were so grateful for the life that she lived, for her independence, and for her being herself right up to the end. She was in her house till a week before she died. Her preference would have been to die in her sleep, but she said maybe she'd just wake up dead one morning. So that would have been her preference, to have died in the bed in the home that she and my father had built 65 years ago. But that didn't happen, but what happened was a really beautiful and natural passing, something that made our sense of loss much more bearable. We miss her every day. I'll miss her the rest of my life, but her death was a natural passing. It was a natural and beautiful end to a full and rich life, and for that, we were all very grateful.
Thank you so much, Jane Ellen. Beautiful. Our next memorial is from our friend Quan Yin. Quan Yin Lynn Williams will be sharing with us the journey that she took with her best friend, fellow grandmother, and beloved Coco, who gave her a unique perspective on dying and death. She'll be sharing that with us right now.
Hello, dear friends. My name is Quan Yin, and I'm calling in from Sayulita, Mexico, where I'm recuperating, as it were, from a week of Sufi camp. And I'm here with 4 very wonderful women, and we're enjoying a house and quiet time. And it's a time for me to reflect on the life and the passing of my very dear friend, Coco Zamila McCarter, who died almost 5 years ago, which seems very difficult to think about because she feels very present to a wonderful cadre of beings who knew and loved her. So I met Coco at a retreat with Sadi Neil Douglas Klotz near Yellowstone Park. And we became friends, but we really became friends when her first grandchild was born. And then a day later, my first grandchild was born. So we bonded as grandmothers and became just the dearest and closest of friends. I live in Spokane, Washington, and she lived in Missoula, Montana, which sounds far away, but really is an easy 3-hour drive over the mountains and through the most beautiful, beautiful land. So when she became sick with breast cancer, she first had her surgery, and she had treatment, and she did everything she was supposed to and did really, really well, and she recovered. But then her cancer recurred. She had to have surgery in Seattle, and at that time, she had a tough time recovering and keeping her sanity, and her sons decided to jailbreak her. She had 4 very tall sons, like 6'8", and they were so loving and good to her and kept an eye on her, and she kept an eye on them, but they were pretty wild. They ended up pulling her out of the hospital and bringing her to my house in Spokane, telling the doctor that since I was a doctor, I could take care of her, all of her drainage tubes and so forth. They neglected all of them to mention that I'd first trained as a pediatrician and then as a psychiatrist and didn't know anything about drainage tubes. But somehow or other, she regained her sanity, she recovered at my house, and we got her back to her home in Missoula. After this surgery, it looked like things were going to go fairly well. And then there was a recurrence. And with the recurrence, she became very ill. It was at this time that, the pedal really comes to the metal, which is, what did we talk about and discuss in terms of your treatment? Before she had the recurrence, and when death wasn't really looming, she wanted a green burial. So we went and explored the possibility of a green burial and found a green burial ground in Florence, Montana, between Missoula and Hamilton. And in Hamilton, there's a large group of friends and Sufis. So she wanted a place that her children could visit and a place that her friends could visit, and we found it. So I have pictures of her and her green burial site, and she's walking all over, and she picked exactly where she'd like to be. And that was all wonderful. She also said that if she got sicker and things needed to be shared with people, that she wanted everyone to know absolutely everything. I had several times been the correspondent about people who were in our community and were dealing with illness, and I knew essentially what to share and what not to share, especially if they were open to things being shared. It's a little bit more difficult if people say, I don't want anybody to know anything, but I want people to pray for me. So I took her at her word, and I shared, the ups and downs of the next stages of what was happening with her. At some point, it was clear that she was continuing to have some difficulties, and it was at that time that we had a memorial service for her, and that was in October, and she died in February. She got to be present at her memorial service and got to hear the wonderful stories that everyone told. A whole bunch of people showed up, and everyone had at least one story, but they were only allowed to tell one story of how they had first encountered or met Coco. These stories were so funny, and they were so full of light and life, and Coco got to laugh and enjoy them, that she was doing fine. So she was recovering then from this follow-up surgery and follow-up treatment and working with hospice, and it was a hybrid hospice, so you could include some medical treatments, but not, you were refusing the big treatments. I wanted to mention that she loved physical cards when she was dealing with this illness. People were encouraged, and I sent out her mailing address. She would touch those cards, a big bowl of cards, every day. And I just want to remind people that that means ever so much more than the emails and texts. Those are okay. But the physical cards with beautiful pictures are just perfect for people who are struggling and dealing with things. They want to be reminded of beauty. So I wanted to mention that and mention you have to decide if you want people to know what's going on with you, essentially how much, and what kind of burial you want, and what kind of memorial service. And then we went, and it was the 4th of July, and we went to 4th of July parties. And at one of them, somebody said, "What's happening with Coco's chest?" And I looked over, and there was a big red rash on her chest. And we went to the hospital, which was not but 5 minutes away, and she had a fever, and she had this huge, what looked like a cellulitis crawling up her chest. The surgeon who was consulted said, I don't know what's in there. I don't know what her surgery shows. Her records are all up in Kalispell in Seattle. All I can do effectively is open her up, and she will be on a respirator and open up at least 28 days. So when he left the room, I said, "Coco, this is exactly what you didn't want. You're in hospice. This is what you don't want." And we, of course, are both weeping as we face the fact that this might be her last days. Her surgeons were unreachable at that time. It was a holiday, 4th of July. And yet one of her sons, Max, was able to find her surgeon fly fishing in Idaho. And he said, "Get up to Kalispell. I'll see you in the morning. I think it's an easily treatable cellulitis." So in the middle of the night, the son, I, Coco, go through a hailstorm and arrive in Kalispell and check into a 2-bedroom hotel and get Coco tucked in. She's obviously quite ill. Next day, we get her to the doctor. He said, "We're putting you in the hospital, antibiotics." And I only tell this story because she was in the hospital for 7 days on antibiotics, following which she had 7 good months of life with people lined up 6 deep to visit her. I may have mentioned this in my previous interview, but it's very poignant because 7 wonderful months is worth a lot. I was in Mexico where I wintered to avoid being in snow and ice, and the sons called me and said, "It's time to come." So I came, I walked in the room, she looked at me and she said, "You're here." We embraced. She said she wanted to eat some yogurt. There was peach yogurt. And that was the last food or any sustenance or liquid or awakeness that she had. She fell asleep after that, and she was getting some sedation and some care. And from that point on, it took 2 or 3 days where people gathered. She was unaware mostly of who was there. So I was privileged to be with her. I got to spend a week, a month when I would go over, and then the people who regularly were visiting and caring for her could take a little break, catch up with themselves, but then come back. And she had so many friends, they were signed up to take care of her. So my advice to people is decide what you want. Make it clear with yourself and others. Decide what kind of burial, what kind of memorial you want, but it's got to be kind of real, and you're free to modify it. And also know when the last days are there, who you want around you. And she wanted, of course, her children, her dear spiritual community, her dear friends, closest friends, amongst whom I was fortunate to count myself. So I want to honor Coco and say thank you for listening.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you, Quani. And I'd like to introduce our next memorial, which was sent to us by Allaudin Mathieu. Allaudin did this memorial in a celebration of the life of Samuel Lewis. In the Sufi tradition, this is called the Urs, and we celebrate each year the day our beloved died as their wedding with the divine. Murshid, or Sufi Sam as many called him, was a respected spiritual leader in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sufism, who in the 1960s was the self-described guru to the hippies in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. He died in early 1971. He was the creator of the first dances of universal peace that are practiced worldwide to this day. You'll be able to find more information on Samuel Lewis and the Dances of Universal Peace in the podcast notes. Let's hear from Allaudin, who is a talented musician and composer and one of Samuel Lewis's first students.
I'm going to read you a little passage which I've read before about the end of Murshid's life, and it appears in a book I've just written, a memoir. It's for me, this scene that I'm talking about is the very proof of Murshid's life. Although when you were around Murshid, every moment was proof of his life. But this is a special moment. I suppose they're all special, but here's one. In the first days of 1971, Murshid took a fatal fall down a straight flight of stairs. He suffered a concussion and a brain contusion. He was hospitalized in a deep coma for 18 days before he died, occasionally emerging, especially in the first week, to speak. We took turns caring for him. When my turn came, it was dinner time. Murshid could eat only Jell-O, which this evening was cut into little cherry red cubes. A tiny white plastic spoon came with the dish. I took over the shift from one of our choir altos who instructed me to feed him only when he opened his mouth. Murshid, lying fitfully on his back, had rashes on his skin. He would reflectively scratch. He would be restless and then motionless. Then his mouth would open, and I would drop in a cube of Jell-O into it. After several cubes and a spell of motionless quiet, Murshid suddenly boomed forth, "I say yes!" It was the voice not of a dying man, but of a confident leader, a voice thrilling in its conviction. Then the scratching, then the opening of the wizened mouth, then the sliding in of the Jell-O cube with the plastic spoon, then quiet again. I waited for the next outburst, and it came a few minutes later, like the first. "I say yes!" Then twice more at longer intervals, until my hour watch was relieved. Gentle reader, what we have here is on one hand red sugar cubes dropping into the dying blackness, and on the other, the eternal power of Murshid's final acceptance. Consider, for a moment, the balance between these. Consider how Samuel Lewis, tiptoeing on the brink of his own mundane extinction, manifests the words that are the essence of creation. This is a good life lesson to remember, a good lesson to realize on each breath. In a final letter dictated upon briefly coming out of his coma, Murshid reported to his Pakistani peer, Barkat Ali, that his transmission of divine wisdom, the commission given him by Inayat Khan 45 years previously had been accomplished. For I believe to have representatives in all purity and goodness for which Allah is capable and which will now be presumed done forever. He passed away 13 days later. Passed away, they say. Away indeed. Where does the light go when it turns off?
Thank you so much, Allaudin. That was beautiful.
And this week's poem is titled Last Night as I Was Sleeping by Antonio Machado, translated by Robert Bly. Anoche cuando dormía, soñé, bendita ilusión, que una fontana fluía dentro de mi corazón. Di, ¿por qué a sequía escondida agua vienes hasta mí? Manantial de nueva vida en donde nunca bebí. Anoche cuando dormía, soñé, bendita ilusión, que una colmena tenía dentro de mi corazón, y las doradas abejas iban fabricando en él, con las amarguras viejas, blanca cera y dulce miel. Anoche cuando dormía, soñé, bendita ilusión, que un ardiente sol lucía dentro de mi corazón. Era ardiente porque daba calores de rojo hogar, y era sol porque alumbraba y porque hacía llorar. Anoche cuando dormía, soñé, bendita ilusión, que era Dios lo que tenía dentro de mi corazón.
Thank you. And now in English. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that a spring was breaking out in my heart. I said, along which secret aqueduct, O water, are you coming to me, water of a new life that I have never drunk? Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that I had a beehive here inside my heart, and the golden bees were making white combs and sweet honey from my old failures. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt, marvelous error, that a fiery sun was giving light inside my heart. It was fiery because I felt warmth as from a hearth, and sun because it gave light and brought tears to my eyes. Last night, as I slept, I dreamt, marvelous error, that it was God I had here inside my heart.
Thank you so much, Wakil. I hope so many people, both English speakers and Spanish speakers, will just revel in this loveliness.
So beautiful.
It is. And we want to hear from all of you. If you've enjoyed today and would like to share some of your stories, we are available for you. You can email us at endoflifeconvo@gmail.com. That's endoflifeconvo@gmail.com.
Thank you so much.
Y adios. Thanks so much for joining us on the End of Life Conversations. We appreciate you and look forward to sharing our stories. Thanks to my daughter Lucero and Nico Rush, who have cheerfully assisted us as our editors and tech support. Additional resources, transcript of this episode, and links to our social media will be in the podcast notes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And please subscribe, tell your friends, follow us on social media, and consider supporting us through Patreon. We want to acknowledge that the music we are using was composed and produced by Charles Heastand.